The dog wouldn't let anyone near her. That was the first thing the paramedics said when they radioed ahead to the Haida Gwaii Health Center. Not that the patient was in critical condition. Not that she'd been unconscious for nearly 18 hours before the Coast Guard cutter found her. The first thing they said was, "There's a dog, and it won't move." Chief Petty Officer Vera Sinclair had spent 11 years with Joint Task Force 2 doing things that didn't appear in any public record. She'd operated in places that weren't on the briefing maps her superiors showed to politicians. She'd made decisions in the dark that she carried into every morning after. When she finally walked away from the Canadian Armed Forces at 31, she didn't go home to family. She didn't go to a city. She went as far north and west as the land would allow, found a small property outside Skydegate on the southern tip of Graham Island, and she stayed there. The nearest grocery store was 40 minutes. The nearest person who knew her name was further than that. She had Atlas. Atlas was a Belgian Malinois, retired from service the same year she was. He'd been her partner through 3 deployments and a classified operation in the Northwest Territories that had lasted 6 weeks and left both of them changed in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. The military didn't use the word bonded in their paperwork. They used terms like Handler Animal Operational Unit and Field Certified K9 Team. But anyone who'd ever seen Vera and Atlas work together knew what it actually was. He didn't obey her. He understood her. When she got sick, he stayed. The infection had started small, a cut on her left forearm from a rusted fence wire she hadn't thought much about. She'd cleaned it, wrapped it, gone to bed. By the 3rd day, she had a fever that climbed past 40. By the 5th day, she couldn't get off the cot in her back room. The satellite phone was on the kitchen counter, 15 feet away, and those 15 feet might as well have been a kilometer. She didn't make it. She passed out on the floor sometime in the early hours of a Tuesday morning in late October, and Atlas lay down beside her and didn't move until the Coast Guard arrived 4 days later, responding to a wellness check requested by a mail carrier who'd noticed her mailbox hadn't been opened in over a week. The Coast Guard officer who found her said later that he'd never seen anything like it. The dog wasn't aggressive in the way a frightened animal is aggressive. He was deliberate. He positioned himself between Vera's body and the door, and he looked at the officer the way a soldier looks at someone who's just walked onto a secured perimeter without clearance. Not panicked, just very, very clear about the terms. It took 40 minutes to get Vera onto the stretcher. Atlas rode in the helicopter with her because there was no other option that anyone was willing to test. The Haida Gwaii Health Center was not a large facility. It served the archipelago's population of roughly 5,000 people across 2 main islands, and it did so with the resources of a mid-sized rural clinic and the staff of people who had specifically chosen to work somewhere that the rest of the world mostly forgot about. Dr. Yusuf Tremblay had been the attending physician there for 7 years. He'd seen hypothermia cases, fishing accidents, the occasional cardiac event. He had not seen a critically ill former special operations soldier arrive with a combat-trained Malinois who had stationed himself at the foot of her bed and was, by any reasonable assessment, running security. "We need to get her on IV fluids and start a broad-spectrum antibiotic immediately," Dr. Tremblay said, standing in the doorway of the room where the paramedics had managed to transfer Vera. "That means someone has to get close enough to start a line." The 3 nurses on shift looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back. "He's been awake for 4 days," one of the paramedics said. "At least, we think so. He looks it." The dog did look it. His eyes were red at the edges. His coat was matted on one side from lying on the floor beside Vera for so long. But his posture was completely still, completely focused, and the energy coming off him was not the energy of an exhausted animal. It was the energy of someone running entirely on purpose. "Someone call animal control," Dr. Tremblay said. "Already did," the charge nurse said. 45 minutes out minimum. Vera's blood pressure was dropping. 45 minutes was not a number anyone in that room was comfortable with. That was when Constance Maher arrived for her shift. Constance Maher was 28 years old and had been a registered nurse at the Haida Gwaii Health Center for 14 months. Before that, she'd spent 2 years in Yellowknife, and before that she'd done a placement in Petawawa that nobody who wasn't from the military world would have understood the significance of. Petawawa was where Canada stationed a significant portion of its special operations personnel. The base hospital there saw the kinds of cases that didn't get discussed in nursing school. The physical damage that came from doing things the human body wasn't designed to do for extended periods of time, in conditions that were never described accurately in the medical intake forms. She'd learned things in Petawawa that hadn't come from any textbook. She walked into the center through the staff entrance, still pulling her jacket off, and nearly walked into the charge nurse, who was coming the other direction, with the expression of someone managing a situation they hadn't trained for. "We have a problem," the charge nurse said, and explained it in 30 seconds. Constance listened. She asked one question. "What unit?" The charge nurse blinked. "What?" The patient. "What unit was she with?" "I." The Coast Guard report said JTF2. "Why does that?" Constance was already moving toward the room. She stopped at the doorway. Dr. Tremblay was still there, watching Atlas with the cautious expression of a man trying to calculate risk without enough variables. The dog's eyes moved to Constance the moment she appeared. He assessed her the way he assessed everyone, quickly, completely, without theatrics. She didn't come into the room. Not yet. She looked at Atlas for a long moment, then very quietly she said one word. "Steady." The room changed. It wasn't that Atlas relaxed. Relaxed wasn't quite the right word for what happened. It was more that something in him recognized the register of the word, the particular cadence of it, the way it was spoken by someone who understood what it meant in context. It was a word from his world, not a command exactly, more like an acknowledgement. "I see what you're doing. I understand why. You can stand down now. She's in good hands." Atlas sat. He didn't move away from the bed, but he sat, and his posture shifted from operational to watchful, and that was enough. Dr. Tremblay looked at Constance with an expression she would describe later as somewhere between relief and bewilderment. "Get me a line kit," she said to no one in particular, and walked into the room. The sepsis was severe, but not yet systemic, in the worst sense. Dr. Tremblay later said they'd had perhaps another 6 hours before the situation became irreversible. The IV went in without incident. Atlas watched the whole procedure without moving from his spot, tracking Constance specifically. Not with suspicion, but with the focused attention of someone who had decided to extend provisional trust and was monitoring whether it was warranted. It took 3 days for Vera to become coherent. She came back to consciousness in pieces, the way people do when their bodies have been fighting a war of their own. The first time she opened her eyes, she saw the ceiling of a room she didn't recognize, and her hand moved before her mind caught up, reaching down the side of the bed, fingers searching. Atlas was there. He put his head under her hand without being asked. She closed her eyes again. The second time she woke, she stayed awake longer. A nurse she didn't know was checking her IV line, moving quietly, not making unnecessary contact the way some people did when they assumed a patient needed reassurance. Vera noticed this. She noticed most things, even half-conscious. "Where am I?" she said. It came out rougher than she intended. "Haida Gwaii Health Center," the nurse said. "You've been here 3 days, you had a serious infection, you're going to be okay." Vera looked at Atlas. "He's been here the whole time," the nurse said. Dr. Tremblay bent about 7 regulations to allow it, but no one was especially eager to argue with him. A pause. With Atlas, I mean, not with Dr. Tremblay. Something moved across Vera's face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Who got the line in?" she said. "One of our nurses. Constance." Vera turned her head toward the window. Outside, the grey November sky pressed down over the water. She didn't say anything for a while. "He let her," she said finally. It wasn't a question. He did. Vera was quiet again. That meant something to her that would have taken a long time to explain to someone who didn't know what Atlas was, what he'd been trained to do, what his standards for trust actually looked like. Atlas did not extend trust easily. She'd watched him evaluate people for years. Handlers, trainers, other operators, senior officers. The ones he accepted fully. The ones he didn't, he made his position unmistakably clear. There was no middle ground with him. There was no probably fine. There was clear and there was not clear, and he'd held a line around her bed for 4 days in a place he'd never been, with strangers, while she was unconscious, and he had let exactly one person through. "I want to meet her," Vera said. Constance came in the following morning. She was matter-of-fact about it, in the way that people are when they're trying not to make a bigger moment out of something than it needs to be, which Vera appreciated. She pulled up the chair beside the bed, checked the vitals on the monitor without being asked, made a note on the tablet she carried. "You're improving faster than we expected," Constance said. "Your baseline fitness is doing a lot of the work." "I want to know what word you used," Vera said. Constance looked up from the tablet. "He let you in," Vera said. "Atlas doesn't do that, not without a reason. What did you say to him?" Constance set the tablet down on her knee. She looked at Atlas, who was lying on the floor beside the bed, awake but still, watching the conversation with the mild attention of someone who's monitoring a frequency they already understand. "Steady," she said. "I said steady. That's not a standard command." "No," Constance agreed, "it's not." A beat passed between them. Vera waited. She'd spent 11 years in environments where information came out when it was ready and not before, and she'd learned to hold silence the way other people held conversation. "I did a placement in Petawawa," Constance said, "before I came here. Base hospital, 2 years. The K9 unit used to come in sometimes, handlers and their dogs, for routine health checks, sometimes for injuries. There was one handler." She paused. "Sergeant Dale Kimura. He had a Malinois named Echo. Echo was like Atlas, not aggressive without cause, but not easy. She had a threshold, and if you crossed it wrong, you knew it. Kimura used to use that word when he was working with her around new people, steady. It was his word for 'I'm here, this person is okay, you can ease up,' not a command, more like a reassurance." Vera was looking at her. "I don't know if Atlas ever worked with Kimura," Constance said. "Maybe he just recognized the tone. Maybe it's a word some handlers use and it travels through the community, and the dogs learn what it means regardless of who says it. I don't know the mechanism." She picked up the tablet again. "I just knew it was worth trying." "Dale Kimura," Vera said slowly. Constance looked up again. "I knew him," Vera said. "Not well, he was with a different unit. But I knew him." She stopped. Something moved behind her eyes, a specific kind of careful, the way you look at a door you've kept closed for a long time. "He was killed in a training accident. About 4 years ago." Constance nodded once. "Short." "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. Atlas lifted his head, looked at Vera, then at Constance, then settled again. "I'm sorry," Vera said. "It was 4 years ago," Constance said, which was not the same thing as saying it didn't matter, and both of them understood that. Recovery was slow the way island recovery is slow, measured in the quality of light through the window, in the gradual return of appetite, in the incremental loosening of the body from whatever had gripped it. Dr. Tremblay was careful and thorough, and once Vera was able to have a real conversation, surprisingly easy to talk to for someone who'd spent the better part of a decade not talking to people if she could help it. "You should have called someone sooner," he said, on about the 5th day. "I know," she said. "Who would you have called?" She didn't answer immediately. The honest answer was that she didn't have a list. The honest answer was that she'd structured her life, specifically, so that the list was short enough to be functionally empty, which had felt like safety for a long time, and was starting to feel, in the fluorescent quiet of a hospital room on an archipelago off the northwest coast of British Columbia, like something else. I would have called Atlas, she said finally, but he doesn't have hands. Dr. Tremblay looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back with the serene impassivity of a creature who had heard himself discussed as a limitation and was choosing not to engage with the framing. He found someone, Dr. Tremblay said. He didn't find her. She found us. He let her in. The doctor shrugged. Maybe that's the same thing. Constance came by every morning. She didn't make it a production. She did her job, checked the IV, monitored the antibiotic response, updated the chart, and then sometimes she stayed a few minutes, and sometimes she didn't, and she never seemed to require anything from Vera, in the way that people sometimes do when they sense a person is carrying something heavy and decide they'd like to be the one to lift it. She just was there. She asked questions when they were medically relevant, and didn't when they weren't. On the 8th day, Vera asked her something. "Why Haida Gwaii?" she said. "You could work anywhere. Petawawa, Ottawa, Vancouver. Why here?" Constance was quiet for a moment. She had a way of going quiet that wasn't evasive but was considered, like someone who'd decided a long time ago that words were worth choosing carefully. "After Dale died, I needed somewhere that was about something other than what I'd been doing," she said. "Petawawa it's a good place. The work is important, but everything there is connected to everything else that's connected to what happened, and I needed some distance between myself and the shape of it." Vera understood this completely. She'd done the same thing geographically, arriving at Skydgate the way you arrive at the last page of something and decide to set it down and not pick it back up. "Does it work?" Vera asked. Constance considered this with the honesty of someone who'd had enough time to form an actual opinion. "Mostly," she said. "It's not forgetting. It's more like the edges get softer. You can still see the shape of what happened, but it doesn't cut the same way." Vera looked out the window. The water was the color of pewter in the afternoon light. A raven was doing something complicated in the updraft above the parking lot. "He used to tell me things," she said, not elaborating, not explaining who. "In the field, when the waiting was the worst part, he'd talk, not about anything important, about his sister's dog, about a lake in Manitoba his family used to go to, about what he wanted to eat when we got home. And I'd listen, and it was the least useful thing in the world, tactically speaking, and it was the thing that made all of it possible to do." She stopped. Atlas raised his head and looked at her, and she put her hand on him without looking down. "I blamed myself," she said quietly. "For 2 years after, I blamed myself. There were decisions made in those last hours, and some of them were mine, and I spent a long time thinking about what would have happened if I'd made different ones." Constance didn't rush to fill the space with reassurance. She waited. "I don't know if I made the wrong calls," Vera said. "I've gone over it enough times that the going over itself has become the problem. It's like trying to see a painting by standing with your nose against the canvas. At some point you have to step back to see what it actually is." "Have you stepped back?" Constance asked. The question landed quietly. Not as a challenge, not as the kind of therapeutic prompt that Vera had sat through in the mandatory debrief sessions after her last deployment and found precisely useless. Just a real question, asked by a person who knew what she was actually asking. "I'm working on it," Vera said. On the 12th day, Constance came in during her lunch break and sat down without her tablet. That was different enough that Vera noticed. "I need to tell you something," Constance said, "and I'm not sure how to say it, so I'm going to say it plainly, and you can do what you want with it." Vera waited. "Dale used to talk about you," Constance said. "Not often, but there was a period, this was maybe a year before the accident, where he was working on something that crossed over with JTF2. He never told me the details, obviously, but he came home one night, and he said he'd been in the field with someone he'd trust anywhere. That was the specific phrasing. Anywhere, not in a firefight, not in a specific type of situation, anywhere. And I asked him what that person's name was, and he said Sinclair, and I didn't think about it again, until the Coast Guard report crossed the desk here 2 weeks ago, and I saw your file." The room was completely still. He didn't blame you, Constance said. Whatever you've been carrying about those decisions. I can't speak to the operational specifics. I don't know them, but I know him, and I know that phrasing, and I know he wouldn't have used it for someone he had doubts about. She paused. I wanted you to know that. I probably should have said it sooner. I wasn't sure if it was my place. Vera was looking at the window, the pewter water, the grey sky. Atlas got up from the floor, walked to her side, and put his head on the bed rail. She put her hand on the back of his neck. He told Echo to steady, she said finally. When he was with people he trusted. That was his signal. Yes, Constance said, and Atlas responded to it. When you used it, yes. Vera was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and was just incrementally beginning to ease. Dogs don't lie, she said. About trust. They can be trained, but they can't be trained to feel something they don't feel. When Atlas let you in, he wasn't following a protocol. He was making a decision. She looked at Constance. I think I trust his judgment more than my own most of the time. That's not necessarily a bad thing, Constance said. No, Vera agreed. But at some point I have to start trusting my own again. It was the most honest thing she'd said out loud in 2 years, maybe longer. It sat in the room between them, solid and specific, the way true things do when you finally stop carrying them alone. She was discharged on a Friday in mid-November, 13 days after she'd arrived unconscious on a helicopter stretcher with a dog running security on her behalf. Dr. Tremblay gave her a detailed rundown of her aftercare requirements, which she listened to with the focused attention she'd once given mission briefings. He also gave her his direct number and told her to use it, which she accepted without argument, which surprised him enough that he mentioned it to the charge nurse afterward. Constance was on shift when Vera came out to the front entrance. Atlas walked beside her, not leashed. He never needed to be, close enough that his shoulder brushed her knee with every other step. Thank you, Vera said. She didn't qualify it. She didn't add anything to it. She'd spent enough of her career in situations where words had operational weight to know when fewer of them were stronger. Constance nodded. Take care of yourself. Call the clinic if anything changes. Vera paused at the door. She looked down at Atlas. He was looking up at her with the particular expression he sometimes had, attentive, patient, not asking for anything but completely present. He recognized something in you, Vera said. He doesn't recognize things without reason. I know, Constance said quietly. That means something to me. She held Constance's gaze for a moment. Not the way strangers do, not the way colleagues do, but the way people do when they have just handed each other something that matters, and both of them know it. Then Vera Sinclair pushed open the door and walked out into the cold grey morning, Atlas steady at her side, and the distance between herself and the rest of the world was, for the first time in a long time, something she was willing to close.